Hi, I'm Chris from Airwindows, and hey, you can do this. Because this is DeRez3. So, what might this thing be? This is more experimentation in things like bit crushing. And I can demonstrate that as follows. Here, let's go to a drum sound. And what bit crushing sounds like is kind of like this. If you turn it off, it's clean. If you set it up so that everything is at 1, it's still basically clean. But you can crush the rate like that. And you can also crush the resolution like this. And the reason you might want to do that is, I don't know, imitating old samplers or something. But the range of adjustability is a little greater than I've had before. And probably the best way for me to show you that is to show you all of the previous versions of DeRez, which are also still available. So you've got all of these in our Airwindows consolidated and standalone plugins. Having a new one doesn't mean the old one stopped being useful. Let's go back to that funny little oscillator thing again. You might notice it's a little bit more smooth than some of them have been. That's because I'm expecting this to be played like an instrument. However, if we had DeRez2, it would be this. And if we had DeRez1, it would be like this. And we've also got differences in res, if I'm not mistaken. Bounce over to the drums again. So the res on the original DeRez is very big and distorting. On DeRez2 here, let's fire that back up again. It does the same thing, but we have an additional control that's called prog. And that seems to affect the res. And of course, rate still does a aggressive bit crushy thing, except for it's a frequency crush. So, as you can hear, this is what you'd expect out of your typical bit crusher, frequency crusher, low res thing. And you can use this hard control on DeRez2 to enhance stuff in interesting ways. And then with DeRez3, we've got a whole different thing going on. We've got a little sort of bit offset on the attack of it, meaning that we can use dry wet to add this sound to the background of stuff, or indeed use a little less res here to dial in whatever amount of staccato you might want, and then rate to darken it. And there you have it. This is not at all the same thing as the previous one, because the whole edge and texture is different enough to justify a whole different version number. They're all kind of different, but the new one has some special qualities outside what I'm doing with Res here, which is designed to do funny things with it. That's basically turned it into a square. Because you see, DeRez3 and its rate control are using a new technique that this is the first you're seeing of it, but it's going to be showing up on a lot of things. And if you've been watching my live streams, you've heard it used on some reverbs. Here's how this works. You can hear it doing a rolly-offy kind of thing. But what this is doing is still sort of sample rate crushing things. But what it does after that is something a little bit new. And it comes from the world of graphics, in fact, not audio at all. I've put out a recent plugin called Crunch Coat that tried a completely different aspect to my undersampling for reverbs and things. And what it did was just take sample positions and sort of draw straight lines between the sample positions, causing a somewhat rolled off sound, but still with some edge to it. But it turns out you can do more than that. What DeRez3 does is it takes recent sample positions at whatever the rate is, even if it's a very slowed down one like this. And we can apply that to other things. For instance, here is a track called Discord Welcome Home, which I'm probably going to be remixing at some point. You see, it's not just a filter. With this one, you can really hear the kind of grind to it. It is obviously a DeRez. It is obviously a bit crusher, especially on those vocals. Less obviously on the drums. When you apply it to a synthesizer sound, it really kind of turns into something else. This is using Bezier curves to reconstruct a waveform at full sample rate. This is 96K sample rate that it's reconstructing it as from the original sample positions, and I'm not sure anybody's done that. I have now, and since it's MIT licensed, everybody else can too. And the interesting thing about it is the way in which rate interacts with the reconstruction. Because originally what I was doing with the downsampling was taking things like reverbs, and if I was at 96K, I would run the reverb every other sample and do a reconstruction. If I was at 192K, I would run the reverb every 4 samples and do a reconstruction between them, but I would be doing the same reconstruction that I used in Crunch Coat, which was a linear interpolation between the points, leaving kind of a corner at each point where it does a new thing. And when you play with Crunch Coat, what you hear is that you can make the sample rate of the internal reverb go way farther down, at the cost of making a nasty, weird sort of grind. Kind of like... kind of like this. hear it in the voices, that they're clearly kind of insane. Turns out I can't simply use a Bezier curve to reconstruct based on arbitrary sample rates. But what I can do is take anything that's meant to sound like a real reverb and use a division of the sample frequency that is an integer number divisor of whatever it is you're using. Meaning you could do every 3 samples or 4 samples or 7 samples or whatever, as long as it always started across. It's a little complicated. Let's not get into that. That's a little more complicated than I needed to get. Point being, I have come up with a way of using this on reverbs and things to let it downsample to arbitrary amounts, meaning that there is like a super sharp old school digital cutoff, but one that is smooth and doesn't have the gnarly overtones that I was beginning to get when making these. And so now I have some new reverbs happening where you get to undersample the reverbs to more than you otherwise would. It'll be sort of different levels of undersampling each time. Like if you're running at 96K, you're going to have different options from when you're at 44.1. But it's all about giving that sort of old school, the very earliest digital reverbs where the sampling rate they were running at was not CD quality or anything even close. And so they got this peculiar dark tone while avoiding the insane, weird overtones that you get from doing a sort of free-running Bezier curve reconstruction of these spaced out sample points in the way I was originally doing it, and in the way that CrunchCode does it, because CrunchCode lets you kind of swoop the reverb pitch up and down and do really horrifying things. But here's the thing. DeRez exults in horrifying noises. With DeRez, you can totally do this. And we just like it better, because it's horrifying. So there's your new toy for low-bit stuff. It's a low-bit thing, but unlike what we're used to in DAW filters and DAW low-bit stuff, where it's just grind and grit, and we think of low-bit stuff that's not retro hardware as being grind and grit. But this isn't. This has a sort of smooth, like the same way that CrunchCode was cursed digital. This has a distinct super retro digital flavor to it, like super retro analog output stages, ladder reconstructors, stacks of resistors, just this crazy, this kind of madness. And we can do it on stuff like that, or we can clean it up and have it be more like 12-bit, and then we can swoop it up.
They all join their hands and they set up a chant
until it is kind of a lot like a antique sampler, but not a plug-in emulation of an antique sampler, more like what you actually heard on old records or when you're working with some kind of old thing. But similarly to the stuff that I'm doing with Console X, this is not an emulation of some kind of classic thing, like your original 16 pad grid samplers with the old, the old 12-bit or 8-bit or whatever, and analog synthesizer filters on the outputs. No. This is a whole other thing, because this is reconstructing the result using completely different techniques. So you can dial in any degree of crazy old vintage sampler mojo to whatever you want without being restricted to the specific hardware that you'd be otherwise stuck with at enormous cost, I might add. Rate is a continuous adjustment, not options for 32K or 16K or whatever. It's a continuous sweep. Res is a continuous sweep. So there's no such thing as like 12-bit, 8-bit, 4-bit, 2-bit. Instead, you gradually bring it in and out.
I saw something very strange when they were watching ponies on the New York Stock Exchange.
To whatever degree you
They
need.
all joined their hands and they set up a chant. And Discord oozed right through
And
the
fine-tune.
screen like horror grunge.
Whatever tone you need out of your vintage sampler mojo wishes. It doesn't have to be a real thing. You're accomplishing a specific mixing goal by choosing something like this, but you don't have to use any specific old school emulation because this is doing the same purpose. Let's hear it on, let me close one of my things, and then let's hear it on the drums. See, here we are on DeRez3. Here's clean. And so if you wanted to dial in a particular sound, let's supposing you don't necessarily want 1-bit, but you want something that is a little crunchy, but maybe a little crunchier than real 12-bit. There's no specific settings for which does which, by the way. Use your ear. So you're listening for a particular kind of voice, a particular kind of place where it does the thing that you want, and we haven't used rate yet. There's where some of our low bit grind comes in. And it feels like that's bringing up the hat in an interesting way. But since we're not bit crushing the sample rate, it's still a little bit bright. But here's what we do about that. Now it's completely dark. And it's being reconstructed using the Bezier filters. But now what we do is we sweep that up until we have about the same level of brightness we want out of our imaginary old vintage sampler. Here's full brightness. And we can tailor the way that the high frequencies sit. And remember, the sandpaper on those hi-hats came out when I made res go lower. So if this is a little too extreme, we can bring it back just a bit. There. So now the edge of that stepped back a little. And we can leave it this dark, or we could make it go a little bit brighter again. And that, of course, is still bright compared to dry. But that's got a strong vintage sampler flavor to it now, up to and including the ability to turn the cymbals into a completely different kind of sound that hits a completely different way. It works a completely different way. And of course, unlike the first DeRez, we have our dry wet. So we can blend. If I'm not mistaken, what I have dry wet doing, which means it should actually be labeled wetness, but forgive me for that, is this is one of those ones where you add wet to the dry, and in the middle you've got both. So we got a little of both here, where we have full dry. And the reason I chose that is because if you were doing something ridiculous and extreme, there, now we've got a fake gated reverb. Now we have a brighter fake gated reverb. we can bring a little bit of this awful noise into the dry signal if we want, without making the dry signal go away, because although I forgot to label this one wetness, this is effectively one of my wetness controls, like in the reverbs. Meaning we can add it as an additional sound. And there you have it. So you could throw this on an individual track of some kind, you could throw this on a snare, whatever, and just do stuff with it. And there you have it. So have fun playing with DeRez. It's possible that once I finish doing Console X, which I am still working actively on, at the moment I'm doing mixes with it to make sure that everything works the way that I want it to work, I might be interested in putting together another kind of console system that is more geared towards what you would do if you were doing very much a hip-hop style sampler-based workflow, but you were trying to make everything come off like your sampler-based workflow inside a regular DAW. Because when you take a regular DAW, you can drag around all the, chop up the recordings and do whatever you want with them. And there are wonderful possibilities that I'm beginning to really enjoy in Reaper with that. But it's not going to sound like a classic sampler-based workflow. But now it should. Now it can. And with that, I'm going to get right back to recording more vinyl records so that I can put out more of those timeless album examples, because I'm putting out examples of what great sounding music sounds like and looks like through the meter plugin I've recently put in. And I'm going to get back to that. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.